Engineers have been trying to replace the Douglas DC-3 since approximately 1945. They have tried with purpose-built STOL aircraft, with turboprop transports, with regional jets, with everything modern aviation has been able to produce across 8 decades of relentless technological advancement. The DC-3 is still flying. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. The aircraft that has come closest, genuinely closest, to finally actually replacing the DC-3 in the most demanding operational environments is a brand new aircraft that carries modern engines, composite materials, and glass cockpit avionics. It also carries roughly the same number of passengers, operates from roughly the same length of runway, has roughly the same range, fills roughly the same commercial niche. It is, in almost every way that matters to the operators who fly it, a DC-3. The question isn't why the DC-3 refused to retire. The question is why the aviation industry needed 90 years and a brand new aircraft to build something that could do what a 1935 design had been doing all along. The answer tells you something important about what aviation actually needs, and what it means to get a design so completely right that the world simply cannot improve on it. To understand why the DC-3 refused to be replaced, you have to understand the specific world it occupied. Not the world of major airports and scheduled international service, but the world underneath that world, the remote world, the world of gravel strips and grass runways, and communities where the distance to the nearest road is measured not in miles but in days. When the DC-3 entered commercial service in 1936, it solved the problem of mainline commercial aviation. It was the first aircraft capable of carrying passengers profitably without government mail subsidies, and it restructured the entire economics of the airline industry around that capability. That story is well known and well documented. What is less well known is what happened to the DC-3 after the mainline airlines moved on to bigger, faster, more economical jet transports. It went to work. Specifically, it went to work in the places that the mainline airlines didn't serve and had no intention of serving. The remote communities of Alaska and northern Canada, the bush routes of South America and the island connections of the Pacific and the Caribbean, the thin market routes in developing countries where the combination of limited runway infrastructure and limited passenger numbers made every other available aircraft a commercial or operational impossibility. In those places, the DC-3's specific combination of capabilities was not merely useful, it was irreplaceable. The aircraft could operate from short, unprepared strips that were simply unavailable to anything larger or heavier. It could carry payloads heavy enough to make remote community supply economically viable. It could be maintained with limited tools and limited specialist knowledge in environments where the nearest certified maintenance facility was hundreds of miles away. It was, in the language of operators who had tried everything else and come back to it, honest. What it offered was what it delivered, without the hidden costs and operational limitations that more sophisticated aircraft brought to environments that couldn't support sophistication. The aviation industry understood this. It also understood, from a business perspective, that there was a market. Not a large market, not a glamorous market, but a real and persistent market for an aircraft that could serve those environments. And so the industry tried, repeatedly and with genuine engineering effort, to produce a replacement. The de Havilland Canada DHC-3 Otter and its successor, the Twin Otter, were serious attempts, rugged, capable, operationally suited to the bush environment. They found loyal operators and served admirably in remote roles. But they were smaller than the DC-3, carrying fewer passengers and less freight, which limited the economics of the routes where the DC-3 had been viable. The Fokker F-27 and its successors were more capable in passenger terms, but required longer runways and more sophisticated maintenance than many remote operators could provide. The British Aerospace ATP, the CASA CN-235, the Dornier 228, each of them answered some of the DC-3's operational brief and not quite all of it. The DC-3 kept flying. Not because operators were sentimental about it, not because they preferred vintage machinery to modern convenience, but because the alternatives required compromises that the specific, unforgiving operational environment of remote aviation simply could not accommodate. If you needed to carry 19 passengers and their freight from a gravel strip 3,000 feet long in conditions that range from tropical heat to Arctic cold, you flew a DC-3. because nothing else could do all of those things simultaneously, reliably, and affordably. That problem, that specific, stubborn, geographically embedded operational problem, is what drove the development of the aircraft that has come closer than anything else to finally replacing the DC-3. The Basler BT-67 extended the DC-3's life by converting existing airframes with turboprop engines and modern systems, essentially building a new aircraft around an 80-year-old structure. It worked. It is still working. But it depended on the availability of donor DC-3 airframes, and those airframes were not going to be available forever. What the market needed was a brand new aircraft designed from scratch to do exactly what the DC-3 had been doing, built with modern materials and modern engines and modern avionics, certified to modern standards, available from a production line rather than from an increasingly scarce pool of vintage airframes. What the market needed, in other words, was a new DC-3. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The aircraft that finally came closest to genuinely replacing the DC-3 arrived from a direction that the aviation industry perhaps should have anticipated but somehow found surprising. Not from the major manufacturers with their enormous development budgets and global marketing organizations, but from the specific, deep, operationally honest tradition of Bush aviation manufacturing that had been quietly building capable short-field aircraft for decades. Several candidates have emerged in recent years that represent genuine attempts to fill the DC-3's specific operational niche with new production aircraft. Each of them illuminates by what they chose to prioritize exactly what the DC-3 was and why it proved so difficult to replicate. The de Havilland Canada DHC-6 Twin Otter, reborn under Viking Air and subsequently under the de Havilland Canada brand, represents one answer. The Twin Otter is not a new design. It dates from the 1960s, but its return to production with modern engines, updated systems, and composite components is an acknowledgement that the operational problem the DC-3 solved in 1936 is still real in 2026, and that the Twin Otter's particular approach to solving it remains competitive. The aircraft is smaller than the DC-3, carries fewer passengers, and generates less revenue per flight. But its operational characteristics in the short-field environment are exceptional, and operators who have tried to replace it with more modern alternatives frequently find themselves returning to it. The Cessna SkyCourier represents a more recent and more direct attempt to address the gap, a 19-passenger turboprop designed specifically for short-haul regional and cargo operations, with a high wing configuration that provides the ground clearance for rough field operations, and a cargo floor engineered for the freight-heavy economics of remote route operation. It is modern in its avionics, its power plant, and its certification basis. It is recognizably DC-3 adjacent in its operational philosophy: payload over luxury, field performance over cruise efficiency, maintainability over sophistication. The ability to carry people and things from places that don't have good airports to places that need them reliably, affordably, and with the specific structural honesty that remote operations demand of aircraft that are going to be a long way from the nearest maintenance hangar when something goes wrong. The DC-3 had all of these qualities in 1936. The aircraft built to replace it in 2026 are defined above everything else by having rediscovered them. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The human experience of DC-3 replacement is a story told by people who have a very specific relationship with aircraft. Not the relationship of admiration or enthusiasm, but the relationship of dependency. These are operators for whom an aircraft is not an object of interest, but a tool of survival, and the standards they apply to that tool are correspondingly unromantic. Bush pilots who have flown the DC-3 and its modern successors describe the transition in terms that are revealing precisely because they are so unsentimental. What they valued about the DC-3 was not its history or its aesthetics or the particular sound of its radial engines, though many of them have affection for all of those things. What they valued was its predictability, its honesty, the way it told you through its controls and its behavior exactly what it was doing and exactly what it was about to do. The way it could absorb the kind of operation that remote environments impose, the rough surfaces, the heavy loads, the improvised maintenance, and keep flying without requiring the pilot to have exceptional skill or exceptional luck on any given day. The pilots who have transitioned to modern DC-3 successors describe a familiar quality in the best of them: a directness, a predictability, a felt sense of structural honesty that the DC-3 embodied so completely. One Bush pilot who flew DC-3s in Alaska for 20 years before transitioning to a modern turboprop successor described the experience this way. The new aircraft is better in every specification. It burns less fuel, it's quieter, the cockpit is infinitely more capable. But when I'm on short final to a strip I've never seen before, in weather I didn't entirely plan for, it feels like the same aircraft. It asks the same things of me, and it gives back the same things in return. The mechanics who maintain DC-3 successors in remote environments carry an institutional knowledge that bridges the generations. People who learned on DC-3s and now maintain turboprop successors who describe the most successful of those successors as aircraft that a competent mechanic can understand completely, can work on without specialized tooling, and can return to service without the kind of support infrastructure that more sophisticated aircraft demand. That quality, the maintainability that the DC-3 embodied and that its best successors have recovered, is not visible in any brochure. It is only visible in the logbooks of aircraft that kept flying when everything around them was breaking down. The passengers on these routes, the remote community residents for whom the aircraft is not a travel option but a lifeline, have the simplest and most honest relationship of all with whatever aircraft serves their strip. They don't care about the history, they don't care about the specifications. They care whether the aircraft arrives, whether it can carry their supplies and their children and their medical evacuations, whether it will be there next week and the week after. The DC-3 earned their trust by showing up consistently for decades. Its successors are earning the same trust the same way. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The conflict in the DC-3 replacement story is not dramatic, it is economic, and it is stubborn, and it has repeated itself with minor variations for 80 years. Every aircraft designed to replace a DC-3 has faced the same fundamental tension. The market that needs a DC-3 replacement is not large enough to support the development costs of a purpose-built replacement at prices the operators of that market can afford. Remote aviation operators fly thin margins on thin routes. They cannot pay the prices that new production aircraft certification and manufacturing demand if those prices are calculated against the production volumes that the remote aviation market generates. The DC-3 was never expensive to operate because its development costs had been amortized across a commercial career that began in 1936 and a military production run of tens of thousands of aircraft. The airframes that survived into the Bush aviation era were available at prices that reflected not what it cost to build them, but what the market would pay for them, which was, for much of the post-war period, very little. That economic reality is not reproducible by any new production aircraft, and the gap between what remote operators can pay and what new aircraft costs has been the primary reason that every replacement program has struggled to achieve the commercial traction its designers hoped for. The manufacturers that have succeeded in the DC-3 successor market, Viking Air with the Twin Otter, Cessna with the Sky Courier, the DART program, have done so by finding ways to manage those development costs that allow final prices to approach what remote operators can sustain. None of them has fully solved the problem. All of them have come closer than anything that preceded them. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The DC-3's legacy in the context of its replacement story is the legacy of a standard so clearly defined and so completely achieved that it became the measure against which everything subsequent was judged. Every aircraft designed to replace the DC-3 has been evaluated by the operators who matter most against the question of whether it does what the DC-3 does, not whether it is faster or quieter or more fuel efficient or equipped with more capable avionics, though all of those things matter. Whether it can take off from that strip, whether it can carry that load, whether it will be serviceable next week without parts that have to be flown in from a maintenance facility 3 countries away. The aircraft that have come closest to genuinely replacing the DC-3 are the ones that answered those questions first and built everything else around the answers. They are recognizable as DC-3 successors not because they copied the design, but because they accepted the operational philosophy, the commitment to utility over elegance, to field performance over cruise efficiency, to honest structural capability over optimized specification sheet performance. The DC-3 is still flying in 2026 because those qualities, however well they have been approximated, have not yet been fully superseded. When they are, when a new production aircraft achieves everything the DC-3 achieves and does so at a price and with a support requirement that remote operators can sustain, the DC-3 will finally retire. Until then, it will keep doing what it has always done: showing up, carrying the load, landing on the strip that nothing else can use, and making every aircraft built to replace it look, in the most important ways, like a DC-3. We began with a paradox: a brand new aircraft designed to replace a 90-year-old design, and the brand new aircraft is, in all the ways that actually matter, another DC-3. That paradox has a resolution, and it is simpler than the engineering history that surrounds it. The DC-3 was right. Not right for its moment, not right for its era, not right in the relative sense of being better than what came before it. Right in the absolute sense. Right about what an aircraft serving remote communities and thin routes and short unprepared strips actually needed to be. Right about the relationship between payload and field performance. Right about the balance between capability and maintainability. Right about what operators in difficult environments could sustain. That rightness didn't expire. It didn't become obsolete. It became a target, a specification that every subsequent design was measured against, and that none of them fully hit until the recent generation of purpose-built successors began to approach it. The aircraft lifting off that gravel strip today, composite fuselage, turboprop engines, glass cockpit, modern certification, is the aviation industry's best current answer to a question that Douglas answered in 1935. The question hasn't changed. It probably never will. And the answer, in every way that matters, is still the DC-3. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.